My name is Dr. Michael John Oliver and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Finance at the Open University. And my talk this afternoon is entitled British Monetary Policy in the 1960s, a Reassessment, and it's a paper co-authored with Forrest Cappy. Until the advent of floating exchange rates in the early 70s, British macroeconomic policy after 1945 has generally been characterised by economic historians as operating within a fixed exchange rate regime. The combination of the fixed exchange rate, the capital controls and limited currency reserves acted as a constraint on the ability of policymakers to pursue an independent monetary policy. Now, recent work on sterling in the 1960s has revealed more about that constraint on UK monetary policy from the external side, and the latest volume in the Bank of England's official history has shed further light on discussions about monetary policy than existing contemporary accounts. Yet what is still required is a more complete picture of the thinking by the monetary authorities, the Treasury and the Bank, in British domestic monetary policy in the 1960s. A closer examination of Treasury and Bank files from the archives reveals how, during the 60s, policymakers discovered that monetary policy operated in a more complicated way than it had in the 1950s. There was endless tinkering by the authorities, and that effectively masked unease with the tools and techniques of monetary policy which the outcome of the 1959 Radcliffe Committee had not settled. This disquiet was particularly marked in the case of the Treasury, and the archival papers revealed disagreements between the Treasury and the Bank, particularly over gilt-edged market policy and how to control the growth of liquidity. During the course of the 60s, the Treasury became far more critical about monetary policy than the 1950s, and were not afraid to challenge the Bank on numerous occasions. By the end of the decade, by the end of the 60s, particularly following the 67 devaluation of sterling and the adoption of domestic credit expansion, the Treasury seemed to be far more willing than the Bank to consider new techniques and methods of monetary control. Now, a reassessment of monetary policy in the 60s is important for two reasons. First, the decade has been labelled as part of the golden age of the 1950 to 73 period. Despite this label, there were recurrent sterling crises and incipient inflation problems, and these were getting worse from the mid-1960s, and that culminated, of course, in that large devaluation in November 1967. Recent technical work by economists has to be complemented by a discussion on the mindset of officials and their reasons and arguments for the policy perspectives which they adopted at that time. The second reason why a reassessment is important, and we argue quite strongly, that the authorities were muddled about their aims and confused about how to achieve them, and effectively they stored up problems which became particularly acute during the 1970s. Now, it's important to actually emphasise that monetary policy played little or no role in monetary policy in the quarter of a century after 1945. The money supply was not believed to be a useful concept, and if it were, it could not be measured, but above all it was irrelevant in policy terms. The Radcliffe Committee had brought together the majority views of policymakers and academic economists, and that report was produced at the end of the 1950s. The central conclusion, and there was none actually listed in the report, but the central conclusion was that velocity was infinite, that what was needed was attention on the whole spectrum of liquidity, and it was the structure of interest rates rather than some notion of the supply of money that was the centrepiece of monetary action. And the belief was, from Radcliffe onwards, that money had a limited role in economic policy making, and that over the 1960s and into the early 70s became hugely contested. Now, it's important to note there were some Treasury officials who were reluctant to fully embrace the new Radcliffe orthodoxy, and they began to connect the money supply to the balance of payments. The archives show how the economists in the Treasury and Bank who departed from such views were quickly dismissed as foolish, in much the same way that the monetarists were dismissed later as cranks in the 1970s. And if you look at it Some of the economists in the Treasury were actually ahead of the curve with their analysis on the money supply at that time. Geoffrey Bell, for example, co-authored a paper with Berman, and it's one of the first to actually employ a flow of fund analysis to the UK's money supply in the decade after 1954. And yet, it was dismissed by the authorities. Another example, an advisor in the Treasury was told that his arguments were dangerous and misleading in 1966, and yet those ideas which he was writing about and arguing from were accepted by Robert Triffin and Fritz Malchap, both experts on international currency problems. And in 2 years, they were restated to the bank and the Treasury by the IMF. Now, the bank was not noted for its economic competence in the 50s and 1960s. At that time, they employed 2.5 economists, and the half, the deputy governor, was said to have a horror of 2 words: economics and research. Under pressure, first from Radcliffe and then more widely, the bank did begin to employ some graduates with economic degrees and to use academic economists on secondment. There were 2 main influences on a reassessment on the role of money in Britain in the 60s. One was a minority resistance to Radcliffe by some academics, and that grew over time and began, of course, to be associated with the work of Milton Friedman and his colleagues at the University of Chicago. The other was the work of the IMF, most closely associated with Jacques Pollock on the monetary approach to the balance of payments. And this slowly made inroads into some parts of British academic life. Pollock's work and the work of the IMF quickly gathered force following the need by the British government for the IMF to actually provide the standby in the early 60s. But really it was the 67 devaluation which played a significant part in altering the terms of the monetary debate in the United Kingdom. The IMF imposed conditions which included more careful monitoring and controlling of the money supply, the monetary aggregates in particular, and their preferred one was domestic credit expansion. Now, there was great resistance in Britain over any idea of the kind of conditions being imposed, but particularly over the use of the monetary aggregates. But the IMF was firm, and there was some grudging acceptance of the need for some kind of monetary control. I think one of the key problems for the UK authorities was they had not fully understood the monetary implications of the currency crisis of the 60s or of the intervention by the bank in the foreign exchange market. And they didn't comprehend the connection between the growth of the domestic money supply and changes in the public sector's borrowing in foreign currency or from abroad. The aftermath of the devaluation and the IMF's intervention into British monetary affairs brought new strains to a relationship between the Treasury and the bank, which, as I suggested earlier, had become more easy from the mid-1960s. Chief among these disagreements was, firstly, how the gilt edge market should operate, secondly, the use of bank rate, and thirdly, how to control liquidity. In all of these discussions, which were distinctly domestic in origin, the external side impinged to a considerable degree. Let's take each briefly. First of all, how the gilt edge market should operate. Initially, the Treasury and Bank appeared to be in agreement, although at the start of the 1960s, the Treasury felt the bank was not succeeding in encouraging the public to hold sufficient quantities of government securities. But the Treasury did accept at that point that the bank's view that it was not going to sell more stock by reducing its price, as they recognised that investors would lose confidence in the integrity of the market if the bank was seen to be causing its fall. Now, some of the downward pressure in the gilt edge market was short-term, but more persistent pressures reflected the weakness of sterling after October 1964, when the Labour government was in power. By 1966, there were clear frustrations in the Treasury with the bank's tactics in the gilt edge market. Some in the Treasury had begun to believe that the bank's strategy was inflexible and prevented the market from bringing about sharp increases in long-term rates, which would in turn cause major problems for future financing and monetary management. Some economists in the Treasury expressed bewilderment about the bank's tactics. The International Monetary Fund, in their Article 8 consultations during May 66, also raised concerns. The second area was bank rate. And debt management policy was essentially hamstrung because of the authorities' view on interest rates. The monetary authorities began the 1960s with the views of Radcliffe very much in the forefront of their minds, but they became steadily more sceptical about using interest rates as a weapon for controlling the domestic economy as the decade wore on. And in fact, the use of bank rate was as far removed from its present use as could be imagined. And there were two reasons for this. One was extreme scepticism over the significance of interest rates for investment purposes. That position derived in part from the studies and surveys of businessmen of the 1930s. But the second and most important reason was that the bank rate was seen as being used for external purposes. Much of the history of the Bank of England had been about the management of the gold standard or exchange rate. And the principal instrument, of course, was the bank rate. Despite this, and the views expressed in Radcliffe that a change in bank rate did affect the external situation, this was not always shared by the authorities. And of course, between 1964 and 1967, there was a heavy reliance on supporting the forward market in sterling rather than raising bank rate, despite the weakness of sterling during that period. And the final area was liquidity, how to control it. There were three main areas of direct control over banks in the 50s and 60s: ceilings on lending, specified direction of lending, and what were known as special deposits. In addition to this, there was the use of hire purchase controls, which were seen as a key part of monetary policy. Now, the use of these kind of controls is partly explicable in terms of a wartime legacy, and partly a reflection of the growing confidence in management of the economy, not through the use of prices or markets, but by direct means, and the belief that bureaucracy knew what mattered and could direct it. Now, the Treasury became disillusioned with special deposits during the first half of the 60s and wanted to introduce what it called a variable liquidity ratio. The bank thought, though, that special deposits worked very well, and they stressed the importance of the psychological impact of special deposits. To consider some of the concerns which were beginning to arise about monetary policy, it was decided to set up a series of seminars from September 1965 with the Chancellor chairing and the bank and Treasury officials in attendance. But these seminars did not really move the debate on for two reasons. First, too often the group as a whole would get bogged down with particular techniques associated with the control mechanism, rather than consider the wider issues associated with monetary policy, which included, of course, interest rate policy, debt management, and changes in the money supply. And this meant effectively that up until the 1967 devaluation, the group on the whole continued to repeat the same discussions that they'd had from the early 1960s. Secondly, and more fundamentally, the problem was that frequently the bank wanted minimum input from the Treasury. The bank did not believe the Treasury should be given the information it had requested, predominantly because it jealously guarded its freedom to operate independently and enjoyed the mystery and complexity of monetary policy. A few words in conclusion. The questions which followed from the Radcliffe Committee's report were fundamental to the conduct of monetary policy through the 1960s and into the 70s. Our article provides a lot more detail on monetary policy in the decade after Radcliffe and draws on material from the Bank and Treasury archives. And effectively, in summary, it shows two key things. First, how the Treasury wrestled with trying to understand what were the objectives of money and debt policy, the effectiveness of funding policy and interest rate policy, and they wrestled with these with a greater sense of urgency and keenness than the bank. This undoubtedly stemmed from an incomplete understanding and lack of expertise within the Treasury, but at the same time it did force them to ask some fundamental questions about monetary policy. And second, how the problems with monetary policy in the 60s were brought to a head following the devaluation of November 67. Thereafter, the bank and the Treasury, with a little help from the IMF, began an extensive reappraisal of monetary policy. Until the turn of the decade, the progress was erratic, but there were at least glimmers of hope that the authorities had moved on from Radcliffe. For example, in February 1969, when bank rate was increased from 7% to 8%, a briefing note for the Chancellor suggested that this was the first increase for a considerable time that was caused by domestic rather than external considerations. A quote, "City editors would be curious to know whether the Chancellor is a convert to Friedmanite monetary theories," ran the briefing paper. The Chancellor could perhaps reply that one does not have to be an out-and-out Friedmanite to regard the growth of credit to the domestic economy, whether provided from the banks, either to the public sector or the private sector or from overseas, as an interesting and significant indicator of the success of economic management, or to attach importance to monetary restraint as part of a total policy for operating on the domestic economy with the objective of correcting the balance of payments. And this caution was re-emphasised in the briefing paper on monetary policy written by the Home Finance Division for the incoming government in June 1970. And they noted again the new emphasis on money post-1967, quote, "did not represent conversion to Friedmanism," and that the research into the relationship between changes in the money supply and national income and expenditure, quote, "is extremely difficult, and it seems unlikely at this stage that it will yield major conclusions for policy in the short term." I think the final observation has to be, did the monetary authorities really know what they were doing within the context of a fixed exchange rate regime? And as we will argue in a later paper, in the 1970s these debates became ever more intense as we moved to a floating exchange rate and the priority was given towards domestic monetary control through money supply targeting.